Have you ever wondered what it would be like to sleep in a world without Netflix, smartphones, or even electric lights? Well, tonight we're diving into something that will completely change how you think about your bedtime routine. We're exploring the absolutely bizarre and fascinating sleep habits of medieval people. And trust me, what you're about to discover will make your worst night's sleep seem like luxury. Before we begin this journey into the strange world of medieval slumber, make sure to hit that like button if you're ready to have your mind blown, and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy diving deep into history's weirdest secrets. And hey, drop a comment letting me know what time you're watching this and where you're tuning in from. It's always incredible to see our community of night owls and history lovers from around the globe. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a story that spans centuries of human sleep behavior that would seem absolutely alien to us today. Because what I'm about to reveal isn't just interesting, it's going to fundamentally shift your perspective on rest, comfort, and what it truly means to get a good night's sleep. Picture this. It's the year 1347, somewhere in rural England. The sun has just disappeared behind the rolling hills, and as darkness blankets the countryside, an entire village prepares for what we would consider the most unusual sleep schedule imaginable. But here's the thing that's going to blow your mind. This wasn't considered weird at all. This was just how human beings naturally slept for thousands of years. You see, before electricity transformed our world, before gas lamps lit up city streets, before even candles became commonplace in ordinary homes, medieval people had developed a sleep pattern so different from ours that modern scientists are still studying it today. And the more they discover, the more they realize that maybe, just maybe, we're the ones doing it wrong. Let me paint you a picture of what a typical medieval night looked like, because it's going to challenge everything you think you know about sleep. As soon as the sun went down, which could be as early as 4 in the afternoon during winter months, families would gather around their hearths, say their evening prayers, and settle in for what they called first sleep. But here's where it gets interesting. After about 4 hours of deep, restful slumber, something extraordinary would happen. These people would wake up. Not because of an alarm clock, not because of a crying baby or a noisy neighbour, but because their bodies were naturally programmed to do so. And this wasn't insomnia. This wasn't a sleep disorder. This was intentional, purposeful, and absolutely normal. What happened next during these midnight hours is where medieval sleep habits become truly fascinating. Between their first sleep and what they called second sleep, medieval people would enter what historians now refer to as the watch period. And during this time, which could last anywhere from 1 to 3 hours, they would engage in activities that might surprise you. Some would tend to their fires, making sure the embers stayed alive through the cold night. Others would check on their livestock, because nothing ruins your sleep cycle quite like wondering if wolves had gotten to your sheep. But perhaps most surprisingly, this quiet midnight hour was considered the ideal time for prayer, meditation, and yes, even intimate relations between married couples. Medieval physicians and marriage manuals of the time noted that during this watch period, the mind was calm, the body was rested, and people were in what they considered the perfect state for both spiritual reflection and physical intimacy. It was believed that children conceived during these quiet midnight hours would be healthier and more intelligent. Whether there's any scientific truth to that claim, we'll never know, but it shows just how seriously they took this unusual sleep pattern. The watch period wasn't just about practical activities, though. This was also when people would engage in what we might call medieval midnight socializing. Neighbors would visit each other, families would tell stories, and in larger households, servants and masters might actually interact more freely than they would during the rigid social structures of daylight hours. Imagine that. Instead of scrolling through your phone at 2 in the morning, medieval people were having meaningful conversations, sharing folklore, and strengthening community bonds. They would discuss the day's events, plan for tomorrow's work, and sometimes even conduct business negotiations. The darkness provided a kind of social equalizer that daylight's strict hierarchies didn't allow. But here's what's truly remarkable about this medieval sleep pattern. Modern sleep researchers have discovered that when people are isolated from artificial light for extended periods, their bodies naturally fall into this exact same rhythm. Scientists call it biphasic sleep, and studies have shown that it might actually be more natural for human beings than our modern 8-hour continuous sleep cycle. Dr. Thomas Weir, a psychiatrist at the National Institute of Mental Health, conducted experiments where participants lived for weeks in conditions similar to medieval times, with no electric lights and only natural daylight. The results were stunning. Within just a few weeks, every single participant developed the same sleep pattern that medieval people had practiced for centuries. 4 hours of sleep, 1 to 3 hours of quiet wakefulness, then another 4 hours of sleep until dawn. This suggests that our ancestors weren't primitive or confused about sleep. They were actually following their body's natural rhythms in ways that we've completely abandoned. When electric lighting became widespread in the late 1800s and early 1900s, we essentially forced our biology to adapt to an artificial schedule. We compressed our natural sleep cycle into one continuous block and convinced ourselves that this was normal. But medieval people understood something about rest that we've forgotten. They knew that the night wasn't just empty time to be unconscious. It was a rich, productive period filled with opportunities for reflection, connection, and restoration that happened in stages, not all at once. The watch period served multiple purposes beyond just breaking up sleep. In a world without modern security systems, having people naturally awake during the deepest part of the night provided a form of community protection. Someone was always alert, always listening for potential dangers like fires, thieves, or wild animals. It was an evolutionary advantage disguised as a sleep habit. Religious communities took this even further. Monasteries and convents built their entire spiritual practices around these natural wake periods. Monks would rise for what they called matins, a prayer service held in the darkest hours of the night. They saw this time as sacred, believing that the quiet darkness brought them closer to the divine. The watch period wasn't just practical, it was holy. Even the wealthy and powerful organized their lives around this rhythm. Medieval courts would hold certain ceremonies during night watch hours, believing that important decisions made in the calm of deep night would be wiser and more thoughtful than those made in the chaos of daylight. Kings and queens would receive visitors, sign documents, and plan military strategies during their watch periods. But as fascinating as the timing of medieval sleep was, the actual experience of trying to rest in the Middle Ages was unlike anything we can imagine today. The very concept of comfort, privacy, and cleanliness that we associate with sleep simply didn't exist for most people. And this is where medieval sleep habits become not just interesting, but genuinely shocking to modern sensibilities. Let's start with beds, or rather what medieval people generously called beds. If you think your mattress is uncomfortable, wait until you hear about what our ancestors slept on. For the vast majority of people, a bed wasn't a piece of furniture at all. It was whatever they could gather, pile up, and lie down on without freezing to death. The typical peasant bed consisted of what was called a pallet, which was essentially a sack stuffed with straw, hay, or if they were particularly fortunate, dried leaves. This wasn't placed on any kind of frame or foundation. It was simply laid directly on the dirt floor of their one-room homes. And if they couldn't afford even this basic luxury, they would sleep directly on loose straw scattered across the ground. Now, imagine trying to get comfortable on what amounts to a bag of dried grass placed on hard-packed earth. The straw would shift and bunch up throughout the night, creating lumps and valleys that would leave you aching by morning. Worse still, straw was the perfect home for insects, mice, and other creatures that medieval people simply had to accept as bedfellows. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs weren't occasional visitors, they were permanent residents. Medieval people developed an almost supernatural tolerance for being bitten, scratched, and crawled on throughout the night. They had to, because the alternative was never sleeping at all. Some households would sprinkle herbs like lavender or mint in their bedding, not for aromatherapy, but in a desperate attempt to repel the armies of insects that called their beds home. The wealthy, of course, had better sleeping arrangements, but even their luxury would seem primitive by today's standards. Noble families might have actual wooden bed frames, raised off the ground to avoid some of the dampness and creatures that lived at floor level. Their mattresses were stuffed with feathers rather than straw, and they had linen sheets that were washed, though not very often. But here's something that would shock modern sleepers. Even in the wealthiest households, privacy was virtually non-existent. Entire families, including children, parents, grandparents, and sometimes even servants, would share the same sleeping space. The concept of having your own bedroom was so foreign that there wasn't even a word for it in most medieval languages. In castles and manor houses, the Great Hall would be transformed into a communal sleeping area each night. Mattresses, pallets, and blankets would be laid out across the floor, and dozens of people would settle down together. Snoring, talking in sleep, getting up to relieve themselves, all of this happened in full view and earshot of everyone else. But perhaps most surprising of all was how medieval people dealt with the cold. Central heating wouldn't be invented for centuries, and glass windows were luxury items that most people couldn't afford. Homes were drafty, damp, and bitterly cold during winter months. The only source of warmth was a central fire, and even that would die down to embers during the night. So how did they stay warm? They shared body heat, not just with family members, but often with their animals as well. Chickens, pigs, goats, and dogs would all crowd into the same space where people slept. This wasn't considered unsanitary or strange. It was a survival strategy. Animals generate significant body heat, and in a world where freezing to death was a real possibility, warmth trumped comfort every time. Medieval people also wore their clothes to bed, not just undergarments, but often their full daily outfits. The idea of special sleepwear was completely foreign. You slept in whatever you had worn during the day, sometimes adding extra layers if the night was particularly cold. Taking off your clothes would have meant losing precious body heat that might be impossible to regain. But the challenges of medieval sleep went far beyond physical discomfort. The very act of falling asleep was fraught with spiritual and supernatural concerns that would seem bizarre to us today. Medieval people believed that sleep was a time when the soul was vulnerable, when evil spirits could influence dreams, and when the boundary between the living world and the realm of the dead became dangerously thin. This is why bedtime prayers weren't just religious observance. They were considered essential protection. Before lying down each night, medieval people would engage in elaborate spiritual preparations designed to safeguard their souls during the vulnerable hours of sleep. They would confess their sins, recite protective prayers, and sometimes even sprinkle holy water around their sleeping area. The fear wasn't just superstition, it was deeply practical. In a world where sudden death from disease, accident, or violence was common, going to sleep meant acknowledging that you might not wake up. Medieval bedtime prayers often included explicit preparations for death, with people literally saying goodnight as if it might be goodbye forever. Children were taught from an early age that sleep was a rehearsal for death, and that proper spiritual preparation was the only thing standing between them and eternal damnation. The famous prayer, "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take," isn't just a quaint children's rhyme. It's a medieval survival manual disguised as a lullaby. Dreams in the medieval world weren't just random neural firing or your brain's way of processing the day's events. They were messages, warnings, prophecies, and sometimes terrifying glimpses into the supernatural realm. Medieval people believed that during sleep the soul partially separated from the body, making it vulnerable to divine visions, demonic temptations, and prophetic revelations that could literally determine their eternal fate. Church doctrine taught that dreams fell into three categories. There were dreams sent by God, which were considered sacred visions that might reveal future events or provide spiritual guidance. Then there were natural dreams, caused by bodily humours and daily experiences, which were generally harmless. But most terrifying of all were dreams sent by Satan, designed to corrupt the soul, plant sinful thoughts, or drive people toward damnation. The problem was that medieval people had no reliable way to tell which type of dream they were experiencing. That peaceful vision of a deceased relative might be a blessed visitation, or it could be a demon in disguise trying to lead you astray. That nightmare about falling into a pit of fire might be a warning from God about your spiritual state, or it could be Satan's attempt to fill your mind with images of hell. This uncertainty created an entire industry of dream interpretation. Monks, priests, and self-proclaimed holy men would analyze dreams for spiritual significance, often charging fees for their services. They had elaborate systems for decoding symbolic meanings. Dreaming of water might represent purification or baptism, but it could also symbolize drowning in sin. Fire could mean the warmth of God's love, or the flames of eternal punishment. Medieval dream interpretation guides were bestsellers of their time, passed down through generations and copied by hand in monasteries across Europe. These books contained hundreds of symbols and their possible meanings, but they always came with warnings. The interpretation of dreams was considered so spiritually dangerous that some religious authorities argued only ordained priests should attempt it. Women's dreams were viewed with particular suspicion. Medieval society already considered women more susceptible to temptation and deception, so their dreams were often dismissed as either meaningless female hysteria or dangerous demonic influence. A woman who claimed to have prophetic dreams might be revered as a mystic, but she was just as likely to be accused of witchcraft. The fear of demonic dreams led to elaborate bedtime rituals designed to protect the sleeping mind. People would place blessed objects under their pillows, recite specific prayers, and even sleep in certain positions, believed to ward off evil influences. Some would tie small bags of herbs or holy relics to their clothing, hoping these talismans would create a spiritual barrier around their dreams. But medieval people didn't just fear bad dreams, they actively sought out good ones. They believed that sleeping in holy places, near religious relics, or after consuming certain blessed foods could induce divine visions. Pilgrims would travel hundreds of miles to sleep in churches where saints were buried, hoping to receive healing dreams or spiritual revelations. The practice of dream incubation became so popular that some monasteries and shrines established special sleeping chambers, where visitors could pay to spend the night in hopes of receiving prophetic dreams. These sacred dormitories were often located directly above the tombs of saints, as close as possible to holy remains that might influence the sleeper's visions. Medieval literature is filled with stories of life-changing dreams. Kings claimed to receive military strategies in visions. Scholars said mathematical theorems were revealed to them in sleep, and artists insisted their greatest works came from divine dreams. Whether these accounts were genuine spiritual experiences or clever ways to claim divine authority for human ideas, they show how seriously medieval society took the world of sleep and dreams. But while the wealthy could afford elaborate dream interpretation services and pilgrimages to holy sites, ordinary people had to navigate their nighttime visions alone. They developed their own folk wisdom about dreams, passed down through families and communities. Certain images were universally considered good omens, while others were seen as warnings of disaster or death. The medieval understanding of dreams also influenced their approach to sleep itself. If your soul was traveling to other realms while you slept, then the physical conditions of your body became even more important. This belief led to some truly bizarre sleeping practices that were designed to enhance spiritual receptivity while protecting against supernatural threats. Some medieval people slept with their heads pointing toward Jerusalem, believing this would align their souls with the holy city during their nightly spiritual journeys. Others insisted on sleeping with certain objects in their hands, particularly crosses, blessed beads, or pieces of holy text, to maintain their connection to divine protection throughout the night. The timing of sleep also took on spiritual significance beyond the practical watch period. Certain hours of the night were considered more spiritually active than others. The period just after midnight was thought to be when the veil between worlds was thinnest, making it both the most dangerous and potentially most revelatory time to be asleep. This spiritual dimension of medieval sleep extended to the very architecture of their homes. Windows weren't just about light and air, they were potential entry points for supernatural forces. Many medieval homes had specific symbols carved around windows and doors, not for decoration, but as protective barriers against evil spirits that might try to influence sleepers. The positioning of beds within a room wasn't random either. Medieval people believed that sleeping with your head toward the east, facing the direction of the rising sun and the Holy Land, would provide spiritual protection and potentially induce holy dreams. Sleeping with your feet toward the door was considered extremely unlucky, as it resembled the position of a corpse being carried out for burial. Even the materials used in bedding carried spiritual significance. Straw from fields that had been blessed by priests was considered superior to ordinary straw. Feathers from certain birds were thought to promote peaceful sleep, while others were believed to cause nightmares. The wealthy would sometimes pay premium prices for bedding materials that had been consecrated or had come from locations with religious significance. These spiritual concerns about sleep created a complex nighttime economy that most people today never consider. Professional watchers, usually older women in the community, would sometimes be hired to sit with people during their sleep, particularly during times of illness or spiritual crisis. These watchers weren't just medical attendants, they were spiritual guardians whose job was to observe the sleeper for signs of supernatural visitation and to perform protective rituals if needed. The medieval obsession with sleep and spirituality also influenced their understanding of insomnia. If you couldn't sleep, it wasn't just a physical problem, it was potentially a spiritual crisis. Chronic sleeplessness might indicate that your soul was under attack, that you had unconfessed sins preventing peaceful rest, or that God was calling you to a more religious life. Monasteries developed elaborate treatments for insomnia that combined herbal remedies with intensive spiritual counseling. Sleepless monks might be assigned additional prayers, fasting periods, or physical labor designed to exhaust the body while purifying the soul. The idea was that proper spiritual alignment would naturally lead to proper sleep. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval sleep spirituality was how it connected individual rest to community welfare. If important people in a village or town were experiencing disturbing dreams or sleep problems, it was often interpreted as a warning about threats to the entire community. Collective prayer sessions, community fasting, and group pilgrimages might be organized to address what was seen as a shared spiritual crisis, manifesting through individual sleep disturbances. This communal approach to sleep problems extended to the practice of dream sharing. Medieval people regularly discussed their dreams with family members, friends, and religious advisors, not just for interpretation, but because they believed that dreams might contain information relevant to the entire community. A peasant's dream about flooding might be taken as seriously as a nobleman's vision of war, because both could represent divine warnings that affected everyone. The social aspect of medieval sleep went far beyond spiritual concerns, though. The sheer logistics of getting rest in a world designed around community survival created sleeping arrangements that would seem impossible to modern people accustomed to privacy and personal space. Consider the medieval inn, which was less like a modern hotel and more like a human storage facility. Travelers didn't rent private rooms. They rented space in a bed, and that bed was usually occupied by complete strangers. A typical in-bed might sleep 4 to 6 people, arranged like sardines, with their belongings serving as pillows and their cloaks as blankets. These shared sleeping arrangements weren't just about saving money, they were about survival. In a world without reliable heating, strangers' body heat might be the difference between a cold night and a deadly one. Innkeepers would actually market their establishments based on how many warm bodies they could fit into each bed, advertising the thermal benefits of communal sleeping. The etiquette of shared sleeping was complex and strictly enforced. There were rules about which side of the bed you could occupy based on your social status, your destination, and even your profession. Merchants might sleep with other merchants, pilgrims with pilgrims, and soldiers with soldiers, creating temporary communities united by nothing more than their shared need for warmth and rest. But shared beds weren't just for travelers. In medieval cities, entire families of different social classes might share sleeping spaces out of economic necessity. Apprentices slept in their masters' homes. Servants shared quarters with the families they served, and even in wealthy households, privacy was a luxury that few could afford. The lack of private sleeping space had profound effects on medieval society that we're only beginning to understand. Without the ability to retreat to private bedrooms, people had to develop different ways of processing emotions, handling conflicts, and maintaining relationships. The medieval mind had to be more resilient to constant social interaction, more skilled at finding moments of solitude within crowded spaces. This communal approach to sleep also meant that everyone's sleep problems became everyone else's problems. If one person in a shared sleeping area was a chronic snorer, suffered from nightmares, or had restless legs, it affected the sleep quality of potentially dozens of other people. Medieval communities developed elaborate social protocols for dealing with disruptive sleepers, ranging from gentle interventions to outright banishment from shared sleeping areas. The consequences of poor sleep in a shared environment weren't just social embarrassment, they could be genuinely dangerous. Medieval people understood that exhausted individuals made poor decisions, and in a world where a moment's inattention could result in injury, fire, or death, ensuring everyone got adequate rest was literally a matter of community survival. This is why medieval societies developed such elaborate systems for managing communal sleep. Large households would designate sleep marshals, usually senior servants or family members, whose job was to organize the nightly sleeping arrangements, resolve conflicts, and ensure that everyone had at least some chance of rest. These sleep marshals had genuine authority and could make decisions about who slept where, when lights were extinguished, and how sleeping space was allocated. The role wasn't ceremonial either. Sleep marshals had to understand the complex social dynamics of their households, know which individuals were compatible sleeping companions, and be able to mediate disputes that arose from the inevitable friction of forced intimacy. They were part diplomat, part logistics coordinator, and part therapist, all in service of getting people through the night. But even with careful management, medieval communal sleeping created problems that would horrify modern hygienists. Personal cleanliness wasn't just uncommon, it was actively discouraged by medical authorities, who believed that bathing opened the pores to disease and evil influences. People went months without washing their bodies or clothes, sleeping night after night in the same unwashed garments, surrounded by others doing exactly the same thing. The smell alone would have been overwhelming by today's standards, but medieval people had adapted to odors that would send modern individuals running for fresh air. They developed techniques for breathing through their mouths while sleeping, positioning themselves to minimize direct contact with the most aromatic companions, and using strong-smelling herbs to mask the worst of the collective human funk. Lice, fleas, and other parasites moved freely through these communal sleeping arrangements like tiny hitchhikers exploring a continent of human hosts. By morning, insects that had started the night on one person might have sampled half a dozen different bodies, spreading not just discomfort, but potentially serious diseases. Medieval people accepted this as an unavoidable aspect of life, developing remarkable tolerance for constant itching and the sensation of small creatures moving through their hair and clothing. The medical understanding of the time actually supported these crowded sleeping arrangements. Medieval physicians believed that humans generated different types of heat and humidity, and that sleeping near people with complementary temperaments could actually improve your health. A person with a cold, dry constitution might be prescribed to sleep next to someone warm and moist, creating what they believed was a therapeutic microclimate. These medical theories led to some truly bizarre sleeping prescriptions. Elderly people might be advised to sleep between young individuals to absorb their vital heat and energy. Sick people were sometimes surrounded by healthy sleepers, who were thought to share their robust humours through proximity. Children were deliberately placed near adults with desired characteristics, in the belief that prolonged nighttime exposure would help them develop similar traits. The wealthy took these theories to extremes that seem almost comical today. Some nobles employed professional bed warmers, servants whose only job was to lie in their masters' beds before bedtime to heat the sheets and mattresses. These bed warmers were chosen not just for their body temperature, but for their supposed moral and physical qualities that might transfer to the primary sleeper. Even more bizarre were the medieval sleep consultants, learned men who claimed expertise in optimizing sleeping arrangements for health and spiritual benefit. These consultants would visit wealthy households and spend days analyzing the sleep patterns, dreams, and physical characteristics of family members before prescribing elaborate sleeping configurations designed to maximize everyone's well-being. The recommendations could be incredibly specific. A consultant might determine that the youngest daughter should sleep on the east side of the family bed to absorb morning energy, while the eldest son belonged on the west side to channel evening calm. Parents might be positioned based on the phases of the moon, the season of the year, or even their astrological signs. But while the wealthy could afford sleep consultants and professional bed warmers, ordinary people had to rely on folk wisdom passed down through generations. Families developed their own sleeping traditions based on what seemed to work, creating elaborate informal protocols about who slept where, when, and in what position. These family sleeping arrangements were taken so seriously that they were often included in inheritance documents and marriage contracts. A bride might negotiate not just her dowry, but her position in her new family's sleeping hierarchy. Children understood from an early age that their sleeping location reflected their status within the family, and that changes in sleeping arrangements often signaled shifts in family dynamics. The death of a family member required complete reorganization of sleeping arrangements, not just because of the empty space, but because medieval people believed that the spiritual energy of the deceased continued to influence their former sleeping area. Some families would abandon certain sleeping locations entirely after a death, while others would hold elaborate blessing ceremonies to cleanse the space for new occupants. But perhaps nowhere were medieval sleeping arrangements more complex than in religious communities. Monasteries and convents had to balance spiritual requirements with practical necessities, creating dormitory systems that were part military barracks, part hospital ward, and part prayer hall. Monastic dormitories were designed around the principle that sleep should be communal, supervised, and spiritually productive. Beds were arranged in long rows with minimal space between them, ensuring that no monk or nun could engage in private activities without being observed by their neighbours. This wasn't just about preventing misconduct. It was based on the belief that solitary sleep was spiritually dangerous. The sleeping schedule in religious communities was even more regimented than in secular households. Bells would ring at precise intervals throughout the night, calling residents to prayer, meditation, or contemplation. These weren't optional activities. They were mandatory interruptions, designed to prevent the deep sleep that religious authorities believed made souls vulnerable to demonic influence. Monks and nuns slept fully clothed in their religious habits, not just for modesty, but because they needed to be ready to leap from their beds at a moment's notice for nighttime prayer services. Some orders required their members to sleep, sitting up, or leaning against walls to prevent the deep unconsciousness that was considered spiritually perilous. The most extreme religious communities practiced what they called vigilant sleeping, where members would take turns staying awake throughout the night to pray over their sleeping companions and watch for signs of spiritual disturbance. These watchers were trained to recognize the physical signs of demonic dreams, holy visions, and other supernatural sleep phenomena. If a sleeping monk or nun showed signs of spiritual crisis, crying out, thrashing, or speaking in their sleep, the watchers would immediately wake them and the entire community for emergency prayers. These midnight spiritual interventions could last for hours, with the entire dormitory engaged in collective prayer and exorcism rituals designed to protect the affected individual's soul. But even in these highly regulated religious environments, the basic human need for rest created persistent problems. Sleep-deprived monks would fall asleep during prayer services, sometimes snoring loudly enough to disrupt the entire community. Nuns would sleepwalk through their dormitories, occasionally performing embarrassing or dangerous acts while unconscious. Religious authorities developed elaborate punishment systems for sleep-related infractions. Falling asleep during prayer might result in extra fasting, additional manual labor, or sleeping on the hard floor instead of on a straw mattress. Chronic sleep problems were often interpreted as signs of spiritual weakness or hidden sin, leading to intensive counseling sessions and sometimes even expulsion from the community. The pressure to maintain perfect spiritual vigilance during sleep created a paradox that medieval religious thinkers struggled to resolve. They needed their bodies to rest in order to function during the day, but they believed that true sleep made their souls vulnerable to damnation. The solution was a form of conscious sleeping that required years of training to master. Advanced practitioners claimed they could remain spiritually aware while allowing their bodies to rest, a technique that sounds remarkably similar to what modern meditation experts call lucid dreaming. These spiritually advanced sleepers reported being able to pray, contemplate religious mysteries, and even have conversations with saints and angels while their bodies appeared to be unconscious. The training required to achieve this conscious sleeping was intense and often dangerous. Novice monks and nuns would practice staying mentally alert while physically exhausted, learning to maintain spiritual awareness even as their bodies demanded rest. Many failed to master the technique and suffered from chronic sleep deprivation that affected their health and mental stability. But those who succeeded became legends within their communities, revered as living saints who had transcended the normal limitations of human consciousness. These masters of conscious sleeping were consulted on spiritual matters, sought out for their prophetic dreams, and sometimes elevated to leadership positions based primarily on their ability to remain spiritually active while physically asleep. The techniques they developed influenced medieval understanding of consciousness, spirituality, and the relationship between mind and body in ways that extended far beyond religious communities. Secular scholars studied these sleep masters, trying to understand how human awareness could function independently of physical consciousness. Medieval physicians incorporated these observations into their medical theories, developing treatments for sleep disorders that combined physical remedies with spiritual exercises designed to maintain mental control during rest. The boundary between medicine and mysticism became increasingly blurred as doctors prescribed prayer, meditation, and conscious sleeping techniques alongside herbal remedies and dietary changes. But while religious communities were experimenting with transcendent sleep practices, the majority of medieval people were simply trying to survive their nights. The physical challenges of medieval sleep went far beyond uncomfortable bedding and crowded conditions. The very air they breathed while sleeping was often toxic, filled with smoke, fumes, and particles that would be considered hazardous by modern standards. Medieval homes were heated by open fires that burned wood, peat, animal dung, or whatever combustible material could be found. These fires produced thick smoke that filled living spaces, creating a perpetual haze that irritated eyes, throats, and lungs. People slept breathing this smoky air night after night, developing chronic respiratory problems that were simply accepted as normal parts of aging. The chimneys that did exist were crude and inefficient, often allowing as much smoke to enter the room as they expelled. Many homes had no chimneys at all, just holes in the roof that provided minimal ventilation, while allowing rain, snow, and cold air to enter freely. Sleeping meant choosing between suffocating in smoke or freezing in drafts. Windows, when they existed, were covered with oiled cloth, thin sheets of animal horn, or crude wooden shutters that blocked both air and light. Opening windows for fresh air meant losing precious heat and potentially allowing dangerous intruders to enter. Most people slept in sealed, smoky environments that would trigger modern fire safety alarms within minutes. The combination of poor ventilation, multiple bodies, and animal occupants created atmospheric conditions that were not just uncomfortable but genuinely dangerous. Carbon monoxide poisoning from poorly ventilated fires probably killed many medieval people in their sleep, though the cause of death would have been attributed to natural causes, divine judgment, or supernatural influence. Medieval people who could afford candles faced additional hazards. Candles were made from animal fat or beeswax, and produced flames that were much more dangerous than modern equivalents. Houses regularly burned down when sleeping individuals knocked over candles, when bedding caught fire from nearby flames, or when poorly made candles exploded or flared unexpectedly. The fear of fire was so pervasive that many families designated fire watchers, individuals who would stay awake in shifts throughout the night to monitor flames and ensure that nothing ignited while others slept. These fire watchers were usually the oldest or youngest family members, those whose sleep was considered less critical than that of the primary workers. But even families with fire watchers faced constant danger. Medieval records are filled with accounts of entire households perishing in nighttime fires that spread too quickly for sleeping people to escape. The combination of wooden buildings, straw bedding, and open flames created fire hazards that claimed thousands of lives each year. The terror of burning alive in their sleep influenced how medieval people positioned themselves for rest. Many slept near doors or windows, ready to escape quickly if fire broke out. Others kept containers of water or sand near their sleeping areas, primitive fire suppression systems that offered little real protection but provided psychological comfort. Wealthy families sometimes employed professional fire guards, servants whose only job was to patrol the house during nighttime hours, watching for signs of fire and maintaining firefighting equipment. These guards were trained to wake sleeping households at the first sign of danger and to coordinate emergency evacuations in the dark. But fire wasn't the only nighttime danger that haunted medieval sleep. The absence of effective law enforcement meant that homes were vulnerable to thieves, brigands, and other criminals who operated under cover of darkness. Sleeping families were easy targets for robbery, assault, and worse. Medieval homes had primitive locks and security systems that offered minimal protection against determined intruders. Most people slept with weapons within easy reach, ready to defend themselves and their families if awakened by the sounds of forced entry. Children were taught from an early age to remain silent and motionless if they heard suspicious noises during the night. The psychological stress of constant vulnerability affected the quality of medieval sleep in ways that modern people, protected by police forces and security systems, can barely imagine. Many medieval people never experienced truly restful sleep because part of their consciousness remained alert for signs of danger throughout the night. This chronic vigilance during sleep may have contributed to the development of the watch period that characterized medieval sleep patterns. If people were naturally waking up every few hours anyway, due to security concerns, it makes sense that they would find productive ways to use these periods of alertness, rather than lying awake, worrying about potential threats. The fear of nighttime violence also influenced medieval sleeping arrangements in ways that went beyond simple family groupings. Communities would sometimes organize collective sleeping areas where multiple families would spend the night together, creating human fortresses that were harder for criminals to attack successfully. These community sleeping arrangements were particularly common during times of war, plague, or social unrest, when the dangers of nighttime isolation outweighed the discomforts of crowded conditions. Entire villages might crowd into churches, barns, or other large buildings, creating temporary dormitories that offered safety through numbers. But even in these protected environments, the quality of sleep was poor. The combination of overcrowding, anxiety, unfamiliar surroundings, and constant noise made deep rest nearly impossible. People would emerge from these collective sleeping experiences exhausted and irritable, but alive, which was often the best outcome they could hope for. The psychological toll of these sleeping conditions extended far beyond mere tiredness. Medieval people lived with chronic sleep deprivation that affected their mental health, decision-making abilities, and emotional stability in ways that probably contributed to the violence, superstition, and social instability that characterized much of the medieval period. Modern sleep research has shown that chronic sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations, paranoia, aggressive behavior, and impaired judgment. It's possible that many of the phenomena that medieval people attributed to supernatural causes, demonic possession, or divine punishment, were actually symptoms of severe sleep disorders caused by their impossible living conditions. The visions, voices, and supernatural experiences that filled medieval accounts of daily life might have been the predictable result of minds pushed beyond their limits by months or years of inadequate rest. The medieval world's obsession with demons, angels, and otherworldly visitations could have been, at least in part, a mass hallucination caused by an entire civilization that was chronically sleep-deprived. This perspective doesn't diminish the genuine spirituality and religious devotion of medieval people, but it does suggest that their sleeping conditions may have created altered states of consciousness that made supernatural experiences seem more common and more real than they would in a well-rested population. The irony is that medieval people were so concerned about the spiritual dangers of sleep that they created physical sleeping conditions that were genuinely dangerous to their mental and physical health. Their elaborate precautions against demonic dreams and supernatural threats may have been responses to very real psychological symptoms caused by the sleep deprivation that their precautions helped to perpetuate. But despite all these challenges, dangers, and discomforts, medieval people did sleep. They found ways to rest, to dream, and to restore their bodies and minds despite conditions that would seem impossible to modern sleepers. Their resilience, adaptability, and sheer determination to survive created a sleep culture that was unlike anything before or since. The medieval approach to sleep reveals fundamental truths about human adaptability and the relationship between culture, environment, and basic biological needs. These people created meaning, community, and even beauty within sleeping conditions that were objectively terrible, finding ways to transform necessity into ritual, survival into spirituality, and shared hardship into human connection. Their sleep habits weren't just weird or primitive. They were sophisticated responses to challenging circumstances that required creativity, cooperation, and courage that most modern people never have to develop. The medieval bedroom wasn't just a place to rest. It was a theatre where the full drama of human existence played out night after night, season after season, generation after generation. Understanding medieval sleep means grappling with a reality that challenges our most basic assumptions about rest and recovery. While we've explored the spiritual dimensions, communal arrangements, and physical hardships of medieval slumber, there's an entire universe of bizarre practices and beliefs that governed how people prepared for, experienced, and recovered from their nightly rest. Let's talk about something that would absolutely baffle modern sleepers: the medieval approach to sleepwear and bedtime preparation. We think of pajamas as a basic necessity, but medieval people had developed an entirely different philosophy about what to wear while sleeping, and their reasoning will surprise you. Most medieval people slept in the exact same clothes they had worn during the day. This wasn't laziness or poor hygiene. Though cleanliness certainly wasn't a priority, it was a calculated survival strategy. In a world where temperatures could drop below freezing inside homes, removing your day clothes meant losing crucial layers of insulation that might mean the difference between life and death. But it went deeper than just warmth. Medieval people believed that changing clothes before sleep made you vulnerable to what they called night vapors, mysterious atmospheric influences that could penetrate exposed skin and cause illness, madness, or death. Medical texts of the time warned against removing clothing after sunset, claiming that the pores of the skin opened during darkness and allowed dangerous humors to enter the body. The wealthy had developed elaborate bedtime clothing rituals that seem almost theatrical by today's standards. Noble families would layer multiple garments before sleep, not just for warmth, but because each layer was believed to provide specific protection against different types of supernatural or medical threats. The innermost layer might be a blessed shirt that had been touched by religious relics or sewn by nuns, designed to protect the soul during its nightly spiritual journey. Over this would go a practical woolen tunic for warmth, then perhaps a cloak that had been treated with herbs believed to repel evil spirits or prevent nightmares. Women's bedtime attire was even more complex, involving head coverings, blessed jewelry, and sometimes even protective amulets sewn directly into their clothing. Married women were expected to keep their heads covered while sleeping, not just for modesty, but because exposed hair was thought to attract demonic attention or cause the soul to become lost during dreams. The process of getting dressed for sleep could take as long as modern people spend getting undressed. Family members would help each other arrange layers, tie protective knots in clothing, and position blessed objects for maximum spiritual protection. This bedtime dressing ritual became a form of family bonding, with parents teaching children the proper techniques for spiritual and physical protection during sleep. But perhaps the most bizarre aspect of medieval sleepwear was the practice of sleeping in shoes. Modern people associate shoes with outdoor activities and consider bare feet essential for comfortable sleep, but medieval people often kept their footwear on throughout the night. This wasn't just about cold floors, though that was certainly a factor. Medieval people believed that the feet were particularly vulnerable to supernatural attack during sleep because they were the part of the body closest to the earth, where evil spirits were thought to dwell. Keeping shoes on created a barrier between the sleeper and these underground demonic forces. Certain types of shoes were considered especially protective during sleep. Iron-studded boots were prized for their ability to repel fairies and evil spirits, while shoes made from the hide of animals killed on holy days were thought to provide divine protection. Some people would wear different shoes to bed than they wore during the day, special sleeping footwear designed specifically for nighttime spiritual defense. The wealthy would sometimes have their sleeping shoes blessed by priests or embedded with holy relics, creating footwear that was more religious artifact than practical protection. These blessed shoes were passed down through families and were considered so valuable that they were often buried with their owners to provide protection in the afterlife. But sleeping in shoes created its own problems. Medieval footwear was made of leather that became stiff and uncomfortable when worn continuously. People would wake up with sore feet, blisters, and sometimes serious infections from wearing damp, dirty shoes for extended periods. The medical understanding of the time actually supported continuous shoe wearing, claiming that removing footwear allowed harmful vapors to enter through the soles of the feet and travel directly to the brain. Medieval physicians prescribed specific types of shoes for different sleep disorders, believing that proper footwear could cure insomnia, prevent nightmares, and even treat mental illness. This obsession with protective sleep clothing extended to accessories that seem almost comical today. Medieval people would go to bed wearing hats, gloves, scarves, and sometimes even primitive masks designed to filter night air, or prevent evil spirits from entering through the mouth and nose. The most elaborate bedtime accessories were worn by people suffering from what medieval medicine called night sickness, a category that included everything from insomnia to sleepwalking to chronic nightmares. These individuals might wear special helmets designed to regulate the flow of humours to the brain, gloves embedded with herbs to prevent sleep-related hand movements, or belts that were supposed to anchor the soul to the body during dreams. Some medieval sleep accessories were genuinely dangerous. People would wear tight bindings around their heads to prevent their skulls from expanding during sleep, a practice based on the mistaken belief that the brain swelled at night and needed to be contained. Others would sleep with metal objects pressed against their bodies, thinking that iron would repel supernatural threats, but often causing injuries or infections. The preparation for sleep also involved elaborate rituals around food and drink that would seem bizarre to modern people accustomed to late-night snacking and bedtime beverages. Medieval people had developed complex theories about how different foods affected sleep, dreams, and spiritual vulnerability that governed what they ate and when. The basic principle was that certain foods made you more susceptible to demonic influence during sleep, while others provided protection. Garlic, onions, and other strong-smelling foods were considered excellent bedtime snacks because their odor was thought to repel evil spirits. Medieval people would often eat raw onions before bed, believing that the resulting bad breath would create a protective barrier around sleeping individuals. But the practice of eating protective foods before sleep created its own problems. Medieval bedrooms filled with people who had consumed large quantities of garlic and onions became incredibly unpleasant environments. The combination of unwashed bodies, animal smells, and deliberately consumed pungent foods created atmospheric conditions that were genuinely toxic. Some medieval people took food-based sleep protection to dangerous extremes. They would consume herbs and plants that were believed to enhance spiritual protection, but were actually poisonous. Medieval medical texts contain recipes for bedtime potions that included toxic ingredients like hemlock, nightshade, and mercury, substances that probably killed more people than they protected. The wealthy could afford exotic protective foods imported from distant lands. Spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were consumed before sleep, not for flavor, but because they were thought to create spiritual barriers that demons couldn't penetrate. These expensive spices became status symbols as much as protective measures, with wealthy families competing to serve the most exotic and supposedly powerful bedtime foods. Medieval people also believed that the timing of meals affected sleep quality and spiritual vulnerability. Eating too close to bedtime was thought to trap food in the stomach during sleep, where it would rot and create vapors that could poison the brain or attract demons. But eating too early meant going to bed hungry, which was believed to make the soul weak and vulnerable to supernatural attack. The solution was a carefully timed bedtime meal that medical authorities called the evening equilibrium. This meal had to be consumed at precisely the right moment, usually about 2 hours before sleep, and had to contain exactly the right balance of foods to provide protection without causing spiritual or physical harm. Creating the perfect evening equilibrium meal required extensive knowledge of medieval medical theory, seasonal variations, individual temperament, and local spiritual threats. Wealthy families employed specialists called sleep cooks, servants who were trained specifically in the preparation of bedtime meals designed to optimize sleep quality and spiritual protection. These sleep cooks were part chef, part pharmacist, and part spiritual advisor. They would analyze the family's recent dreams, assess their spiritual state, and prepare customized bedtime meals designed to address specific sleep-related problems. A family member suffering from nightmares might receive a meal heavy in blessed bread and holy water, while someone with insomnia might be served foods that were thought to cool the brain and encourage rest. The recipes used by sleep cooks were closely guarded secrets, passed down through generations and sometimes sold for enormous sums to wealthy families desperate to improve their sleep quality. Some of these recipes were genuinely helpful, incorporating herbs and foods that actually do promote relaxation and better sleep. Others were based on complete superstition and may have actually made sleep problems worse. But perhaps the most bizarre aspect of medieval bedtime food rituals was the practice of dream feeding. Medieval people believed that certain foods consumed before sleep would influence the content and meaning of dreams, allowing them to receive specific types of visions or spiritual messages. Someone hoping to dream of a deceased relative might eat foods that the dead person had enjoyed in life, believing this would attract their spirit during sleep. People seeking prophetic dreams would consume foods mentioned in religious texts, thinking this would open their minds to divine revelation. Those trying to avoid nightmares would eat bland, colorless foods that were thought to create spiritually neutral dreams. The practice of dream feeding became so elaborate that some medieval people would plan their bedtime meals weeks in advance, carefully timing the consumption of specific foods to coincide with religious holidays, astronomical events, or personal anniversaries when certain types of dreams were considered most likely to occur. Medieval dream feeding created an entire industry of specialist food providers who claimed expertise in sleep-related nutrition. These dream merchants would travel from town to town, selling exotic foods and mysterious potions that were supposed to guarantee specific types of dreams or prevent unwanted nighttime visions. Many of these dream foods were probably harmless, consisting of common herbs and spices that were given elaborate backstories and sold at inflated prices to gullible customers. But some dream merchants sold genuinely dangerous substances, including hallucinogenic plants and toxic minerals that could cause serious illness or death. The demand for dream-inducing foods was so high that it created a black market in substances that religious authorities considered spiritually dangerous. Underground networks of herbalists, alchemists, and folk healers would smuggle banned dream foods into communities where they were officially prohibited, selling them to desperate people willing to risk legal punishment for the chance at better sleep or more meaningful dreams. This underground dream food trade connected medieval sleep practices to broader networks of forbidden knowledge, supernatural beliefs, and religious dissent that challenged official church doctrine about dreams and spiritual communication. People who used banned dream foods were sometimes accused of witchcraft, heresy, or demonic communication, crimes that could result in imprisonment, torture, or execution. But despite these risks, the practice of dream feeding persisted throughout the medieval period and beyond, demonstrating just how desperately people wanted to control their sleep experiences and find meaning in their nightly visions. The willingness to risk everything for better dreams reveals how central sleep was to medieval people's understanding of themselves, their relationships with the divine, and their place in the cosmic order. The medieval obsession with controlling sleep extended beyond food and clothing to elaborate rituals performed in and around the bedroom itself. These weren't just personal habits, they were community practices that involved entire households and sometimes whole neighborhoods in the nightly preparation for rest. Medieval people believed that the physical environment of sleep was just as important as personal preparation, and they developed incredibly detailed protocols for arranging sleeping spaces to maximize both comfort and spiritual protection. Every aspect of the bedroom, from the direction of the bed to the objects placed around it, was governed by rules that combined practical wisdom with supernatural beliefs. The positioning of beds wasn't random or based simply on convenience. Medieval people followed elaborate guidelines about bed placement that took into account the cardinal directions, the phases of the moon, the season of the year, and the spiritual history of the room itself. A bed placed in the wrong location could supposedly cause everything from insomnia to demonic possession. East-facing beds were generally preferred because they aligned sleepers with the direction of the rising sun and the Holy Land of Jerusalem. This orientation was thought to provide divine protection during sleep and to ensure that the soul's nightly spiritual journey would be guided toward holy rather than evil influences. People would sometimes go to enormous expense to modify their homes so that beds could face the proper direction. But the ideal bed orientation varied depending on individual circumstances. Sick people might be positioned to face south, toward the supposed source of healing energies, while pregnant women were often placed facing north to align with what medieval people believed were fertility-enhancing cosmic forces. Children's beds were positioned based on their parents' assessment of their spiritual needs and character development goals. The area around the bed was treated like a sacred space that required careful preparation and maintenance. Medieval people would create protective circles around their sleeping areas using blessed salt, holy water, or herbs that were thought to repel evil spirits. These circles had to be renewed regularly and required specific prayers and rituals to maintain their effectiveness. Some families would place protective objects at the four corners of the sleeping area, creating what they called a spiritual fortress around the sleepers. These objects might include religious relics, iron implements, precious stones, or personal items that had been blessed by priests or had special family significance. The most elaborate bedroom protection rituals involved multiple family members working together to prepare the sleeping space each night. Children would be assigned to sprinkle protective herbs. Adults would arrange blessed objects, and elderly family members would recite prayers and perform blessing ceremonies designed to sanctify the area for safe sleep. These nightly bedroom preparation rituals could take hours to complete and involved the entire household in complex choreographed activities. Everyone had specific roles and responsibilities, and failure to perform the rituals correctly was believed to put the entire family at risk of supernatural attack during sleep. The rituals also served important social functions beyond their supposed spiritual benefits. They provided structure to the evening hours, created opportunities for family bonding, and gave everyone a sense of participation in protecting the household's well-being. Children learned responsibility and community values through their roles in the bedtime preparations. But the elaborate nature of these rituals also created stress and anxiety that probably interfered with sleep quality. Families would worry about whether they had performed the rituals correctly, whether they had forgotten any crucial steps, or whether their protective measures were adequate to defend against the supernatural threats they believed surrounded them. The fear of making mistakes in bedtime rituals led to the development of increasingly complex and time-consuming ceremonies that became ends in themselves rather than means to better sleep. Some families spent so much time preparing their bedrooms for spiritual protection that they had little time left for actual rest. Medieval people also developed elaborate systems for monitoring and interpreting sleep-related phenomena that went far beyond simple dream analysis. They believed that everything that happened during sleep, from snoring patterns to body movements to sleep talking, carried spiritual or medical significance that needed to be carefully observed and decoded. Families would designate sleep watchers, usually rotating the responsibility among different members, whose job was to observe sleeping individuals throughout the night and record anything unusual or potentially meaningful. These sleep watchers would note the time, duration, and characteristics of any sleep disturbances, creating detailed logs that were analysed for patterns and significance. The information gathered by sleep watchers was used to make decisions about everything from medical treatment to spiritual counselling to major life choices. A change in someone's snoring pattern might be interpreted as a sign of approaching illness, while unusual sleep movements could indicate spiritual problems that required immediate attention. Sleep watchers were trained to recognize dozens of different types of sleep behaviors and their supposed meanings. Grinding teeth might indicate internal anger or spiritual conflict, while restless leg movements could suggest that the soul was trying to escape the body during dreams. Even the position someone naturally assumed while sleeping was considered diagnostically significant. The most skilled sleep watchers could supposedly predict future events based on their observations of sleeping individuals. They would look for subtle changes in breathing patterns, facial expressions, or body positioning that they believed indicated incoming spiritual messages or warnings about future dangers. This systematic observation of sleep created a medieval science of sleep analysis that combined genuine medical insights with elaborate superstitions. Some of the patterns that sleep watchers identified were probably real indicators of health problems or psychological states, while others were based on complete fantasy. The practice of sleep watching also created new forms of family tension and social control. Being constantly observed while sleeping was psychologically stressful and probably interfered with sleep quality. People would worry about what their sleep behaviors might reveal about their spiritual state, or what consequences might result from unusual sleep patterns. Some individuals became obsessed with controlling their sleep behaviors to avoid negative interpretations from sleep watchers. They would try to maintain specific sleeping positions, control their breathing patterns, or suppress natural sleep movements, creating artificial sleep behaviors that were even more psychologically stressful than being observed. The social pressure created by sleep watching led to the development of what medieval people called virtuous sleeping, the practice of deliberately performing ideal sleep behaviors for the benefit of observers. People would train themselves to sleep in positions that were considered spiritually pure, to maintain facial expressions that suggested holy dreams, and to avoid any sleep behaviors that might be interpreted negatively. But the most fascinating aspect of medieval sleep watching was how it created communities of shared sleep knowledge. Sleep watchers would compare their observations with others in their community, developing local expertise about sleep patterns, their meanings, and their implications for individual and community well-being. This shared sleep knowledge became part of the oral tradition that bound medieval communities together. Stories about remarkable sleep phenomena, interpretations of unusual dreams, and theories about the spiritual significance of sleep behaviors were passed down through generations and became part of local folklore. The communal nature of sleep knowledge also meant that individual sleep problems became community concerns that required collective solutions. If someone developed chronic sleep disturbances, it wasn't just a personal medical issue, it was a community problem that might require group prayers, collective fasting, or even intervention by religious authorities. Medieval communities would sometimes organize group sleep sessions where multiple families would sleep together while community elders watched for signs of spiritual problems or supernatural threats. These community sleep events were part social gathering, part medical examination, and part religious ceremony. The most elaborate community sleep events were organized around religious holidays or times of crisis when the entire community felt spiritually vulnerable. During these events, dozens or even hundreds of people would gather in churches, barns, or other large buildings to sleep under the protection of blessed spaces and community vigilance. These mass sleep gatherings created unique social dynamics that don't exist in modern society. People who might never interact during daylight hours would find themselves sleeping side by side, sharing the most vulnerable and intimate aspects of human experience. Social hierarchies would temporarily dissolve as everyone faced the same fundamental need for rest and protection. The logistics of organizing community sleep events were incredibly complex and required sophisticated coordination and planning. Community leaders had to arrange sleeping space, organize food and water, coordinate protective rituals, and manage the social dynamics of dozens of families sleeping in close quarters. But despite the challenges, these community sleep events were often remembered as positive experiences that strengthened social bonds and created lasting friendships. People would form connections during these vulnerable shared experiences that lasted for years and sometimes influenced major life decisions like marriages, business partnerships, and political alliances. The medieval approach to sleep reveals a fundamental truth about human nature that modern individualistic society has largely forgotten. For our ancestors, sleep wasn't a private, personal experience. It was a community activity that required cooperation, mutual support, and shared responsibility for everyone's well-being. Their elaborate sleep rituals, protective practices, and community observations weren't just superstitious nonsense. They were sophisticated social technologies that helped groups of people survive in dangerous and uncertain conditions. The medieval bedroom was a laboratory where communities experimented with different approaches to rest, recovery, and spiritual protection. Modern people who complain about their sleep problems might benefit from remembering that their medieval ancestors faced challenges that make contemporary sleep difficulties seem trivial by comparison. They managed to rest, dream, and recover despite conditions that would seem impossible to endure, and they did it by working together, supporting each other, and finding meaning in shared hardship. The weird sleep habits of medieval people weren't just historical curiosities. They were creative solutions to fundamental human problems that still exist today. Their emphasis on community support, spiritual preparation, and environmental awareness might seem primitive, but it reflected a sophisticated understanding of sleep as a complex biological and social phenomenon that affects every aspect of human life. Perhaps most importantly, medieval sleep practices remind us that there's no single correct way to rest and recover. Human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures who can find ways to sleep, dream, and restore themselves under almost any conditions, as long as they have the support of their communities and the courage to keep trying night after night. The medieval world's approach to sleep challenges our modern assumptions about privacy, individualism, and the relationship between physical comfort and psychological well-being. Their willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for community safety and spiritual protection suggests values and priorities that might seem foreign to contemporary sensibilities, but reflect deep truths about human nature and social cooperation. As we've journeyed through the strange and fascinating world of medieval sleep, from their bizarre two-phase sleep cycles to their elaborate spiritual preparations, from their crowded communal bedrooms to their dangerous heating systems, one thing becomes clear. Our ancestors lived in a world where every night was an adventure. Every dream was potentially significant, and every morning represented a small miracle of survival. Their sleep habits weren't just weird, they were adaptive responses to challenges that required creativity, courage, and an unshakable commitment to community survival. The medieval bedroom was a theatre where the full drama of human existence played out nightly, where families bonded through shared vulnerability, where communities worked together to protect their most defenseless members, and where individuals found ways to rest and recover despite conditions that would challenge even the most resilient modern sleepers. Understanding these medieval sleep realities forces us to confront something that might be even more shocking than their physical hardships. The mental and emotional toll of medieval sleep wasn't just about discomfort or inconvenience. It was about living with a level of psychological stress that would probably break most modern minds within weeks. Consider what it meant to close your eyes each night, knowing that you might not wake up. Not in the abstract way that modern people occasionally contemplate mortality, but with the immediate, visceral awareness that death was a genuine possibility before dawn. Medieval people went to sleep every night conducting what amounted to a final inventory of their souls, just in case this was their last opportunity to make peace with eternity. This wasn't paranoia or excessive anxiety. It was rational fear based on daily reality. Disease could kill you overnight. Fires could consume entire buildings in minutes. Raiders could attack without warning. Even something as simple as a change in weather could prove fatal to people living in drafty, poorly insulated homes with inadequate heating and nutrition. The psychological preparation required for this kind of sleep was immense. Medieval people had to develop mental techniques for accepting the possibility of death while still maintaining enough hope and energy to function during waking hours. They created elaborate mental frameworks that allowed them to surrender control over their survival while still taking practical steps to protect themselves. This daily confrontation with mortality gave medieval sleep a spiritual intensity that modern people rarely experience. Going to bed wasn't just about rest and recovery. It was about practicing for death, rehearsing the ultimate surrender of consciousness, and preparing their souls for whatever might come next. The prayers they recited before sleep weren't just religious observances. They were psychological survival tools that helped them process the terror of nightly vulnerability. These bedtime prayers often included detailed confessions of sins, expressions of gratitude for survival through another day, and requests for protection that read like negotiations with divine powers who held life and death in their hands. But perhaps most remarkably, medieval people found ways to transform this nightly terror into sources of meaning, connection, and even beauty. Their elaborate bedtime rituals created structure and purpose that helped them feel some sense of control over uncontrollable circumstances. Their communal sleeping arrangements turned individual vulnerability into shared strength. The stories they told during their watch periods weren't just entertainment. They were ways of passing down wisdom, preserving cultural memory, and creating bonds that helped communities survive crises that would have destroyed groups of isolated individuals. Their willingness to share beds with strangers wasn't just about warmth. It was about recognizing fundamental human kinship in the face of universal threats. Medieval sleep also reveals something profound about human adaptability that modern comfort has largely obscured. These people developed extraordinary tolerance for discomfort, inconvenience, and uncertainty because they had no choice. But rather than simply enduring these hardships, they found ways to extract value, meaning, and even joy from circumstances that would seem unbearable to contemporary standards. Their ability to sleep deeply despite noise, smells, crowding, and danger suggests mental disciplines that most modern people never develop. They learned to compartmentalize anxiety, to find rest within chaos, and to maintain psychological equilibrium under conditions of constant stress. Modern sleep research has shown that people can adapt to almost any sleeping conditions if they're consistent and if the sleeper feels safe within their community. Medieval people achieved both of these conditions through social structures and cultural practices that prioritized collective survival over individual comfort. Their sleep patterns also reveal sophisticated understanding of human psychology that predates modern scientific knowledge by centuries. The watch period wasn't just a quirk of pre-electric lighting, it was an intuitive recognition that consciousness needs periodic breaks from the intensity of continuous sleep. During these midnight hours, medieval people processed the day's experiences, resolved conflicts, made plans, and strengthened relationships in ways that continuous sleep doesn't allow. They understood that the mind needs time to integrate experiences, and they built this integration time directly into their sleep cycles. The spiritual dimensions of their sleep practices weren't just superstition. They were early forms of what modern psychology would recognize as meditation, visualization, and cognitive behavioral therapy. Their bedtime prayers helped them process anxiety and fear. Their protective rituals gave them sense of agency and control. Their dream interpretation provided frameworks for understanding subconscious experiences. Even their seemingly bizarre food practices contained genuine wisdom. Eating garlic and onions before bed probably did provide some protection against illness, though not through supernatural mechanisms. Their emphasis on timing meals correctly reflected intuitive understanding of how digestion affects sleep quality. Their insistence on wearing protective clothing to bed served psychological functions that were probably more important than any physical benefits. Feeling prepared and protected helped them relax enough to actually fall asleep, despite legitimate dangers surrounding them. But medieval sleep practices also reveal the dark side of community-based survival strategies. The constant observation, judgment, and social pressure that characterized their sleeping arrangements came with psychological costs that were probably severe. Living without privacy meant never having opportunities for authentic self-expression or emotional processing that required solitude. The fear of being judged based on sleep behaviors created additional layers of anxiety that interfered with natural rest patterns. The pressure to conform to community sleep standards prevented individuals from developing personalized approaches to rest that might have been more effective. The religious intensity surrounding sleep created spiritual anxiety that was probably as disruptive as physical discomfort. people worried constantly about the state of their souls, the meaning of their dreams, and their vulnerability to supernatural threats. This spiritual hypervigilance may have protected them from some psychological dangers, but it created others. Medieval people also lived with chronic sleep deprivation that affected their cognitive abilities, emotional regulation, and decision-making in ways that probably contributed to the violence, superstition, and social instability that characterized much of the medieval period. Sleep-deprived individuals are more prone to aggression, paranoia, and poor judgment, all of which were abundant in medieval society. The irony is that their elaborate precautions against sleep-related dangers may have created the very problems they were trying to prevent. Their fear of demons and evil spirits was probably exacerbated by the hallucinations and psychological disturbances that result from chronic sleep deprivation. Their obsession with spiritual purity during sleep may have created the anxiety and guilt that made restful sleep impossible. Their community-based protective systems may have generated the social tensions and conflicts that made communities feel dangerous in the first place. Modern people who romanticize medieval life often overlook these psychological costs of pre-modern survival strategies. The community solidarity and spiritual intensity that characterized medieval culture came at the price of individual autonomy and psychological freedom that most contemporary people would find intolerable. But understanding these costs doesn't diminish the remarkable achievements of medieval sleep culture. These people created meaning, beauty, and human connection under circumstances that would challenge the strongest modern individuals. They developed social technologies for collective survival that allowed human communities to persist through centuries of war, disease, and environmental catastrophe. Their sleep practices weren't just about getting through the night. They were about maintaining the cultural continuity that preserved human civilization through its darkest periods. The stories told during watch periods, the prayers recited before sleep, the protective rituals performed in bedrooms. All of these practices transmitted values, knowledge, and social bonds from generation to generation. Medieval sleep was a laboratory where communities experimented with different approaches to the fundamental human challenges of vulnerability, mortality, and mutual dependence. Their solutions weren't perfect, but they worked well enough to carry human civilization through centuries of crisis and change. Perhaps most importantly, medieval sleep practices demonstrate that there are many different ways to organize human rest and recovery. Our modern emphasis on individual comfort, privacy, and uninterrupted sleep isn't the only possible approach, and it may not even be the best approach for all circumstances. The medieval world's emphasis on community support, spiritual preparation, and shared responsibility for collective well-being offers insights that might be valuable for addressing contemporary sleep problems. Their understanding of sleep as a social and spiritual activity, rather than just a biological necessity, suggests dimensions of rest that modern individualistic culture largely ignores. As we face modern challenges like social isolation, anxiety disorders, and the psychological costs of technological acceleration, we might benefit from reconsidering some aspects of the medieval approach to sleep. Not their specific practices, which were adapted to very different circumstances, but their underlying principles of community support, spiritual preparation, and acceptance of vulnerability. The weird sleep habits of medieval people weren't just historical curiosities. They were creative responses to universal human needs that still exist today. Their willingness to sacrifice individual comfort for collective security, their integration of spiritual and practical concerns, and their recognition of sleep as a community activity all reflect insights about human nature that transcend historical periods. Modern sleep science has confirmed many intuitions that medieval people developed through centuries of experimentation. The importance of consistent sleep schedules, the value of bedtime rituals, the connection between mental state and sleep quality, the benefits of feeling safe and supported. All of these insights were embedded in medieval sleep practices long before they were validated by scientific research. But perhaps the most important lesson from medieval sleep is about human resilience and adaptability. These people found ways to rest, dream, and recover under conditions that would seem impossible to endure. They created beauty and meaning within circumstances that were objectively terrible. They maintained hope and community spirit despite facing dangers that would overwhelm most modern individuals. Their example reminds us that human beings are capable of extraordinary adaptation when they work together, support each other, and maintain faith in the possibility of survival and flourishing. The medieval bedroom wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a testament to the human capacity for finding light in darkness, rest in chaos, and community in the face of universal vulnerability. The strange world of medieval sleep reveals fundamental truths about human nature that remain relevant today. We are social creatures who need community support to thrive. We are spiritual beings who require meaning and purpose to face life's challenges. We are adaptive organisms capable of extraordinary resilience when circumstances demand it. Understanding how our ancestors slept doesn't just satisfy historical curiosity, it expands our sense of human possibility. If medieval people could find ways to rest and recover under such challenging circumstances, perhaps modern people facing contemporary sleep challenges can discover new approaches that combine the best insights from past and present. The medieval approach to sleep challenges us to think beyond individual solutions to collective approaches, beyond purely physical interventions to spiritual and social dimensions of rest, beyond comfort-focused strategies to resilience-building practices that prepare us for uncertainty and challenge. Their weird sleep habits weren't just products of primitive conditions. They were sophisticated responses to fundamental human needs that persist across historical periods. The specific practices may seem bizarre, but the underlying wisdom about community, preparation, and acceptance of vulnerability offers insights that could benefit anyone struggling with the universal human challenge of finding rest in an uncertain world. As we close this journey through the strange landscape of medieval sleep, we're left with a profound appreciation for both how far we've come and how much we might have lost along the way. The medieval bedroom was a place of terror and beauty, community and conflict, survival and transcendence. It was a laboratory where human beings experimented with the fundamental challenges of existence and discovered truths about rest, recovery, and resilience that echo across the centuries. Their sleep habits may have been weird by modern standards, but they were also deeply human responses to universal challenges that continue to shape our lives today. Understanding their approach to sleep doesn't just illuminate the past, it expands our vision of human possibility and reminds us that there are always new ways to approach the ancient challenge of finding peace in the darkness. The ingenuity of medieval people in adapting to their harsh sleeping realities extended into areas that would seem almost unimaginable to us today. While we've explored their communal arrangements and spiritual preparations, there's an entire dimension of medieval sleep that reveals just how resourceful these people were when it came to the most basic human need for rest. Let's talk about something that would absolutely horrify modern parents: medieval children's sleep arrangements. We think of childhood as a time requiring special protection and comfort, but medieval children experienced sleep in ways that would challenge every contemporary assumption about child safety and development. Medieval children didn't have their own bedrooms, their own beds, or even their own sleeping spaces within shared beds. From the moment they were weaned, which often happened much later than modern standards, children were integrated into adult sleeping arrangements without any special accommodations for their size, needs, or vulnerability. The youngest children would sleep directly between their parents, not for bonding or comfort, but for warmth and protection. These tiny bodies served as living hot water bottles, generating heat that helped keep the entire family warm during brutal winter nights. Parents would wrap infants in layers of cloth and position them strategically to maximize heat distribution throughout the family sleeping area. But this practical arrangement created dangers that medieval people simply accepted as unavoidable risks. Infant mortality from what we now call sudden infant death syndrome was probably much higher than historical records indicate, partly because babies were regularly smothered by sleeping adults who rolled over on them during the night. Medieval people developed the term overlaying to describe these accidental deaths, and they occurred so frequently that the church created special prayers and absolution rituals for parents who had accidentally killed their children while sleeping. The guilt and trauma of overlaying haunted families for generations, but the alternative of letting infants sleep alone meant almost certain death from cold. Older children faced different but equally challenging sleeping arrangements. By the age of 5 or 6, children were expected to find their own sleeping spaces within the family area, often curling up at the feet of adults like human pets. They learned to sleep through adult conversations, snoring, intimate relations, and all the other activities that happened in shared sleeping spaces. These children developed extraordinary abilities to fall asleep anywhere, under any conditions, at any time. They could sleep sitting up, standing against walls, or crammed into spaces that would seem impossibly small and uncomfortable. This adaptability was a survival skill that served them throughout their lives, but it came at psychological costs that we're only beginning to understand. Medieval children who survived to adulthood often carried deep-seated anxieties about sleep that affected their entire lives. They had learned from infancy that sleep was dangerous, that comfort was temporary, and that survival required constant vigilance even during rest. These early experiences shaped their approach to sleep as adults and influenced how they raised their own children. The lack of child-specific sleeping arrangements also meant that medieval children were exposed to adult activities and conversations that modern society would consider inappropriate or traumatic. They witnessed domestic violence, sexual relations, death and dying, and intense emotional conflicts, all while lying in the same sleeping spaces as the adults involved. This exposure created a kind of premature psychological development that forced children to process adult experiences before they had the emotional tools to handle them. Medieval children often seemed remarkably mature and resilient by modern standards, but this maturity came at the cost of childhood innocence and psychological safety. The medieval approach to children's sleep was based on practical necessity rather than developmental understanding. Families simply didn't have the resources to create separate sleeping arrangements for children, and the dangers of the medieval world made it seem safer to keep children close rather than isolated. But medieval people weren't completely insensitive to children's sleep needs. They developed folk practices and cultural traditions designed to help children cope with their challenging sleeping arrangements. Lullabies weren't just entertainment. They were psychological tools that helped children process fear and anxiety about sleep. Medieval lullabies were often darker and more complex than their modern counterparts, addressing themes of death, danger, and survival that reflected the realities of medieval childhood. These songs help children develop coping mechanisms for the psychological challenges of sleeping in dangerous, uncomfortable conditions. Storytelling during the watch period also served important functions for medieval children. The tales told during these midnight hours weren't just entertainment. They were cultural education that taught children about their world, their values, and their place in society. Children learned history, morality, and practical survival skills through stories told in the darkness. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval children's sleep was how they learned to find comfort and security within circumstances that would terrify modern children. They developed attachment relationships with family members, found safety in familiar routines, and created meaning from shared hardship in ways that demonstrated extraordinary psychological resilience. These children grew up understanding that comfort was earned rather than expected, that safety came from community rather than isolation, and that survival required cooperation rather than individual advantage. These lessons shaped medieval society in profound ways that influenced everything from social structures to economic systems to political arrangements. The medieval approach to children's sleep also reveals something important about human developmental plasticity. Children who grew up in these challenging conditions develop capabilities and tolerances that modern children never need to acquire. They became extraordinarily hardy, adaptable, and resourceful because their survival depended on these qualities. Modern child development experts might argue that medieval children were deprived of essential developmental experiences, and there's probably truth to this perspective. But it's also possible that these children developed strengths and capabilities that modern childhood, with all its protections and comforts, doesn't foster. The question of whether medieval or modern approaches to children's sleep are better is probably unanswerable, because they were designed for completely different worlds with different dangers, opportunities, and values. But understanding medieval children's sleep experiences expands our sense of human developmental possibility and challenges assumptions about what children need to thrive. Medieval approaches to children's sleep also influence their understanding of family relationships and social hierarchies in ways that persisted throughout their lives. Children who had slept at the feet of adults learned their place in social orders that emphasized hierarchy, respect for authority, and acceptance of their position within community structures. These sleep-based lessons in social hierarchy were reinforced by the physical arrangements of medieval bedrooms, where sleeping position reflected social status, age, and family importance. Children internalize these hierarchies through nightly experience in ways that shape their behavior and expectations throughout their lives. The medieval family bedroom was a laboratory for social education, where children learned complex lessons about power, authority, intimacy, and survival through direct physical experience. These lessons were probably more powerful and lasting than any formal education they might receive, because they were learned through the body during the vulnerable state of sleep. Understanding medieval children's sleep helps explain many aspects of medieval society that seem puzzling from modern perspectives. The acceptance of hierarchy, the emphasis on community over individual needs, the tolerance for discomfort and hardship. All of these cultural characteristics were shaped by childhood experiences of sleeping in challenging communal arrangements. But medieval children's sleep experiences also fostered positive qualities that modern childhood might not develop as effectively. These children learned early that their survival depended on others, that community cooperation was essential, and that individual comfort was less important than collective well-being. They developed empathy, resilience, and social awareness through shared vulnerability that created bonds and understanding that lasted throughout their lives. The medieval emphasis on community solidarity and mutual support was partly rooted in childhood experiences of depending on others for basic safety and comfort during sleep. The transition from medieval to modern approaches to children's sleep represents one of the most dramatic changes in human child-rearing practices in recorded history. The shift from communal to individual sleeping arrangements for children reflects broader changes in social values, economic conditions, and understanding of human development. Modern parents who struggle with children's sleep problems might benefit from understanding how medieval children learn to sleep under much more challenging conditions. Not by replicating medieval practices, which would be inappropriate and potentially dangerous in modern contexts, but by recognizing that children are capable of greater adaptability and resilience than contemporary parenting often assumes. The medieval example suggests that some modern sleep problems might be partly created by excessive protection and comfort that prevents children from developing natural coping mechanisms. While we shouldn't expose children to medieval levels of hardship, we might consider whether some controlled challenges could help children develop better sleep skills and greater resilience. Medieval children's sleep experiences also highlight the importance of community support systems in child development. These children survived and thrived partly because they were embedded in communities that took collective responsibility for their well-being. Modern parents often feel isolated and overwhelmed by child-rearing responsibilities that medieval communities shared among multiple adults. The medieval approach to children's sleep reminds us that childhood is a cultural construction that varies dramatically across time and place. What seems essential for healthy child development in one context might be unnecessary or even harmful in another. Understanding this variation expands our sense of human possibility and challenges assumptions about optimal child-rearing practices. But perhaps most importantly, medieval children's sleep experiences demonstrate the extraordinary adaptability of human beings, especially during their formative years. Children who grew up in medieval sleeping conditions developed capabilities that seem almost superhuman by modern standards, suggesting that human potential is far greater than contemporary comfortable conditions allow us to realize. The legacy of medieval children's sleep continues to influence modern society in ways that most people don't recognize. Many contemporary attitudes toward hardship, community, and individual responsibility were shaped by generations of ancestors who learned fundamental life lessons through challenging childhood sleep experiences. Understanding this legacy doesn't mean we should return to medieval practices, but it does suggest that we might benefit from incorporating some of their insights about resilience, community, and the relationship between challenge and growth into modern approaches to child development and sleep. The weird sleep habits of medieval children weren't just historical curiosities. They were adaptive responses to challenging conditions that fostered qualities and capabilities that helped human communities survive and thrive through centuries of hardship. Their example reminds us that children are capable of extraordinary adaptation when circumstances require it, and when they have the support of caring communities. As we consider modern challenges in children's sleep and development, we might benefit from the medieval understanding that comfort and safety are important, but so are resilience, adaptability, and the ability to find rest and peace, even in challenging circumstances. The balance between protection and challenge, between individual comfort and community needs, remains one of the fundamental dilemmas of human child-rearing across all historical periods. Medieval approaches to sleep also included practices around death and dying that would seem shocking to modern sensibilities, but reveal profound insights about how communities dealt with mortality and grief. In a world where death was a constant presence, the boundary between sleep and death was much more permeable than contemporary people can easily understand. Medieval people regularly slept in the same rooms as dying family members, not just during final moments, but throughout extended illnesses that could last for weeks or months. This wasn't considered morbid or inappropriate. It was seen as essential community support that helped dying individuals transition peacefully while providing comfort and closure for surviving family members. The medieval deathbed wasn't a sterile medical environment. It was a community gathering place where families would maintain continuous vigils that combined practical care with spiritual preparation. These vigils often lasted for days, with family members taking turns sleeping near the dying person to provide comfort and witness their final moments. These death vigils created unique sleeping arrangements where the boundary between life and death became part of the nightly experience. Family members would sleep within arm's reach of dying relatives, waking periodically to check on their condition, provide water or comfort, or simply maintain the human connection that medieval people believed was essential for peaceful dying. The presence of death in medieval sleeping spaces wasn't just about practical care, it served important psychological and spiritual functions for the entire community. Children grew up understanding death as a natural part of life rather than a medical failure or personal tragedy. They learned to face mortality with acceptance rather than denial or terror. This intimate familiarity with death shaped medieval attitudes towards sleep in profound ways. People who regularly slept near dying individuals developed different relationships with unconsciousness, vulnerability, and the daily risk of not waking up. Sleep became a nightly rehearsal for death that helped people develop psychological preparedness for their own mortality. Medieval people also practiced what they called death sleeping, where individuals would deliberately sleep in positions, locations, or conditions that reminded them of death. This wasn't morbid fascination, it was spiritual preparation that helped people develop acceptance of mortality and reduce their fear of dying. Some medieval people would sleep on hard floors rather than comfortable beds, wear simple shroud-like garments to bed, or position themselves in ways that resembled corpses. These practices were designed to help people become comfortable with the idea of death and reduce the anxiety that came from excessive attachment to life. Religious communities took death sleeping to even greater extremes, with monks and nuns sometimes sleeping in actual coffins or tombs as part of their spiritual discipline. These practices weren't just about accepting mortality, they were about developing detachment from worldly concerns and focusing on eternal rather than temporal values. The medieval practice of sleeping with the dead also extended beyond deathbed vigils to include what modern people would consider disturbing customs around corpse preparation and burial. Families would often keep deceased relatives in their homes for days or weeks before burial, and during this time, they would continue to sleep in the same spaces as the corpses. This practice served practical functions in a world without refrigeration or professional funeral services. Families needed time to prepare for burials, gather relatives from distant locations, and arrange for proper religious ceremonies. Keeping corpses at home was often the only practical option, but sleeping with corpses also served important psychological functions that helped communities process grief and maintain connections with deceased loved ones. The gradual transition from living person to absent memory was mediated by this period of physical presence that allowed families to adjust slowly to their loss. Medieval people believed that the souls of the recently deceased remained near their bodies for several days after death, and that maintaining physical proximity during this transition period was important for both the living and the dead. Sleeping near corpses was seen as a final act of love and service that helped souls complete their journey to the afterlife. These beliefs about post-mortem soul presence influenced medieval sleeping practices in ways that extended far beyond actual death situations. People would sometimes sleep in locations where loved ones had died, believing that this maintained spiritual connections and allowed for continued communication through dreams. Medieval cemeteries were also common sleeping locations for people seeking connection with deceased relatives or hoping to receive messages from the dead through dreams. These cemetery sleepers weren't just grieving individuals, they included people seeking spiritual guidance, prophetic visions, or healing that they believed could come through contact with the spirits of the dead. The practice of cemetery sleeping was so common that many medieval cemeteries had designated areas with basic shelters for living visitors who wanted to spend nights near the graves of their loved ones. These cemetery dormitories were part of the social infrastructure that helped communities manage grief and maintain spiritual connections across the boundary of death. Medieval approaches to death and sleep also influenced their understanding of dreams and spiritual communication in ways that created elaborate systems of belief about messages from the deceased. Dreams that occurred while sleeping near corpses or in cemeteries were considered particularly significant and were often interpreted as direct communication from the dead. These death-related dreams weren't just personal experiences, they were community events that could influence major decisions about everything from inheritance disputes to military campaigns. The dreams of people who slept with the dead were often treated as prophetic visions that carried authority equal to religious revelation. The social importance of death dreams created a specialized role for people who were particularly skilled at sleeping in death-related locations and interpreting the visions they received. These death dreamers became informal community leaders whose spiritual insights influenced major decisions and helped resolve conflicts. But the medieval integration of death into sleep experiences also created psychological challenges that were probably severe. living in constant intimate contact with mortality created anxiety, depression, and trauma that affected entire communities. The psychological cost of medieval death practices was probably enormous, even though it was rarely acknowledged or addressed. Children who grew up sleeping near corpses and dying relatives developed different relationships with death than modern children, but these relationships weren't necessarily healthier or more adaptive. Medieval children often showed signs of what modern psychology would recognize as trauma responses, including anxiety disorders, depression, and difficulty forming secure attachments. The medieval acceptance of death was probably partly a psychological defense mechanism that helped people function in circumstances where grief and loss were constant experiences. This acceptance came at the cost of emotional depth and psychological flexibility that might have made medieval people more resilient in some ways, but less capable of joy and emotional connection in others. Modern approaches to death and sleep represent a dramatic shift away from medieval practices, but this shift has created its own problems. Contemporary people often have little direct experience with death and dying, which can make mortality seem more terrifying and unnatural than it actually is. The modern separation of death from daily life means that when people do encounter mortality, they're often unprepared psychologically and spiritually. The medieval integration of death into sleep experiences, despite its psychological costs, provided a kind of death education that helped people develop coping mechanisms for inevitable losses. Understanding medieval death and sleep practices doesn't mean we should return to sleeping with corpses or maintaining deathbed vigils, but it does suggest that modern society might benefit from more honest and direct engagement with mortality. The complete separation of death from daily experience that characterizes contemporary life might create more problems than it solves. Medieval people understood something about the relationship between sleep and death that modern medical approaches often overlook. Sleep is a daily practice of surrender, vulnerability, and trust that prepares us psychologically for the ultimate surrender that death represents. The medieval integration of these experiences, despite its disturbing aspects, reflected genuine insights about human psychology and spiritual development. The weird sleep habits of medieval people around death and dying weren't just products of primitive medical understanding. They were sophisticated responses to fundamental human needs for meaning, connection, and preparation for mortality that continue to exist today. Their approaches may seem bizarre, but they addressed real psychological and spiritual challenges that modern society often ignores or handles less effectively. Perhaps the most important lesson from medieval death and sleep practices is about the importance of community support during times of loss and transition. Medieval people faced death and dying as community experiences that brought people together rather than isolating them. This communal approach to mortality provided psychological resources that helped individuals cope with losses that would overwhelm isolated modern people. The medieval bedroom was a place where life and death intersected daily, where communities gathered to support each other through the most challenging human experiences, and where people learned to find peace and meaning even in the face of ultimate uncertainty. Their strange practices around death and sleep reflected deep wisdom about human nature and community needs that transcends historical periods and remains relevant today. Understanding these practices expands our sense of human possibility and challenges contemporary assumptions about the best ways to handle mortality, grief, and the psychological challenges of being human in an uncertain world. The medieval approach to death and sleep reminds us that there are many different ways to organize human responses to mortality, and that our modern approaches, while more comfortable, aren't necessarily more wise or effective. The legacy of medieval death and sleep practices continues to influence contemporary culture in subtle ways, particularly in religious traditions, family customs, and cultural attitudes toward aging and dying. Many modern practices around death and mourning are simplified versions of medieval traditions that once provided more comprehensive community support for people facing loss. As modern society grapples with aging populations, medical technologies that extend dying processes, and social isolation that leaves many people facing death alone, we might benefit from reconsidering some aspects of the medieval approach to death and sleep, not their specific practices, which were adapted to very different circumstances, but their underlying principles of community support, spiritual preparation, and integration of mortality into daily life. The weird sleep habits of medieval people around death reveal fundamental truths about human nature that remain relevant across historical periods. We are mortal beings who need community support to face our mortality. We are meaning-making creatures who require frameworks for understanding death and loss. We are social animals who find strength and comfort in shared experiences of vulnerability and transition. Medieval approaches to death and sleep demonstrate that it's possible to create cultural practices that help people face mortality with dignity, community support, and spiritual preparation. Their example challenges us to think creatively about how modern society might better support people through the universal human experiences of aging, dying, and grieving that no amount of medical advancement can eliminate. The medieval bedroom wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a laboratory where communities experimented with fundamental questions about life, death, meaning, and human connection. Their weird practices reflected serious attempts to address challenges that every human society must face, and their solutions, while imperfect, offer insights that could benefit anyone trying to understand how to live fully in the face of mortality. As we conclude our journey through the strange and fascinating world of medieval sleep, we're left with a profound appreciation for the complexity, creativity, and resilience of our ancestors. Their sleep habits may seem weird by modern standards, but they represent sophisticated responses to fundamental human challenges that continue to shape our lives today. The medieval approach to sleep reveals truths about human nature, community needs, and the relationship between physical comfort and psychological well-being that transcend historical periods. Their willingness to sacrifice individual comfort for collective survival, their integration of spiritual and practical concerns, and their recognition of sleep as a community activity all reflect insights about human flourishing that remain relevant in contemporary contexts. Perhaps most importantly, the weird sleep habits of medieval people remind us that human beings are capable of extraordinary adaptation, creativity, and resilience when circumstances demand it. Their example expands our sense of human possibility and challenges us to think beyond contemporary assumptions about the best ways to organize rest, recovery, and community life. Understanding medieval sleep doesn't just satisfy historical curiosity. It provides perspectives that could benefit anyone struggling with modern sleep challenges, community isolation, or the universal human need to find meaning and connection in the face of uncertainty and vulnerability. Their weird habits weren't just products of primitive conditions. They were creative solutions to timeless human challenges that continue to require wisdom, courage, and community support. The medieval world's relationship with sleep becomes even more bizarre when we examine their understanding of what we might call sleep medicine, though calling it medicine is generous at best. Medieval physicians, working with a combination of ancient Greek theories, folk wisdom, and religious doctrine, developed treatments for sleep disorders that would seem like elaborate pranks if they weren't taken so seriously by everyone involved. Medieval medical theory was based on the concept of the four humours, bodily fluids that supposedly determined everything from personality to health to sleep quality. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile needed to be perfectly balanced for proper rest. And when they weren't, the prescribed treatments were often more dangerous than the original sleep problems. If someone couldn't fall asleep, medieval physicians might diagnose an excess of hot, dry humours that were keeping the brain too active. The solution was bloodletting, the practice of deliberately cutting open veins to drain what they believed was surplus blood. Patients would be bled until they were weak enough to collapse into unconsciousness. which medieval doctors considered successful treatment for insomnia. But bloodletting was just the beginning. Medieval physicians also prescribed purging, the use of powerful laxatives and emetics to forcibly empty the stomach and bowels. The theory was that digestive blockages prevented proper sleep by trapping corrupted humours in the body. Patients would spend hours violently vomiting and experiencing diarrhea, after which they would be so exhausted and dehydrated that they had no choice but to sleep. For patients suffering from nightmares, medieval doctors often recommended trepanation, the practice of drilling holes in the skull to release evil vapours that were supposedly trapped inside the brain. This procedure was performed with primitive tools, no anesthesia, and absolutely no understanding of sterile technique. Many patients died from infection, but those who survived sometimes reported that their nightmares stopped, probably because they were too traumatized to sleep deeply enough to dream. Medieval physicians also prescribed bizarre dietary treatments for sleep disorders that combined genuine nutritional wisdom with complete superstition. Patients with insomnia might be fed diets consisting entirely of lettuce and poppies, plants that actually do contain mild sedative compounds. But they would also be required to eat these foods while standing on one foot, facing east, and reciting specific prayers, because medieval medicine never met a simple solution it couldn't complicate. Sleepwalking was treated with even more dramatic interventions. Medieval doctors believed that sleepwalkers were possessed by demons who were using their bodies for nighttime adventures. The standard treatment involved chaining the patient to their bed, blessing them with holy water, and sometimes performing full exorcisms, complete with prayers, incantations, and religious relics. But the most bizarre medieval sleep treatments involved what they called humoral balancing through environmental manipulation. Patients would be placed in rooms heated to specific temperatures, surrounded by objects of particular colors, and exposed to carefully controlled sounds and smells designed to rebalance their internal fluids. A patient diagnosed with too much cold, wet phlegm might be placed in a red room heated by multiple fires, surrounded by spicy foods and loud music. Someone with excess hot, dry yellow bile would be put in a blue room cooled with ice, surrounded by bland foods and soft singing. These environmental prescriptions could last for weeks and required enormous resources to maintain. Medieval physicians also developed elaborate theories about the relationship between sleep position and health that led to some truly uncomfortable prescribed sleeping arrangements. Different sleep positions were thought to encourage different humoral flows, and doctors would prescribe specific postures designed to cure particular ailments. Patients with digestive problems might be required to sleep standing up, leaning against specially constructed frames that kept them vertical throughout the night. Those with respiratory issues would be forced to sleep face down, with their heads hanging off the edge of their beds. People suffering from melancholy were sometimes required to sleep upside down, suspended from ropes or chains. These prescribed sleep positions were often maintained for months at a time, causing muscle cramps, joint problems, and circulation issues that were probably worse than the original complaints. But medieval physicians interpreted any changes in the patient's condition as evidence that their treatments were working, even when those changes were clearly harmful. The wealthy could afford even more elaborate sleep treatments that involved teams of specialists working together to create optimal sleeping conditions. Sleep physicians would collaborate with astronomers to determine the best times for rest based on planetary alignments. They would work with musicians to compose specific melodies designed to induce particular types of dreams. They would consult with perfumers to create scent combinations that supposedly balanced humours while the patient slept. These comprehensive sleep treatment programs could cost fortunes and involve dozens of servants and specialists. Wealthy patients might have their bedrooms completely reconstructed multiple times as physicians adjusted their environmental prescriptions. Some nobles spent more on sleep treatments than on food, housing, or clothing. desperately seeking solutions to sleep problems that were probably caused by the stress of living in medieval times. But medieval sleep medicine wasn't limited to physical treatments. Physicians also prescribed elaborate mental exercises designed to prepare the mind for proper rest. Patients would be taught specific visualization techniques, memorization exercises, and meditation practices that were supposed to calm their thoughts and encourage healthy sleep. Some of these mental techniques were actually quite sophisticated and resembled modern cognitive behavioral therapy approaches to sleep disorders. Patients were taught to identify anxious thoughts that prevented sleep and replace them with calming mental imagery. They learned breathing techniques and progressive muscle relaxation exercises that genuinely could help promote rest. But these genuinely helpful techniques were mixed with bizarre psychological prescriptions that reflected medieval misunderstandings about how the mind worked. Patients might be required to memorize hundreds of lines of religious poetry before bed, perform complex mathematical calculations while lying down, or visualize elaborate symbolic scenarios involving saints, demons, and mythical creatures. Medieval physicians also believed that certain mental activities during the day could prevent proper sleep at night. Reading too much was thought to overheat the brain and cause insomnia. Thinking about money or business was believed to create spiritual impurities that attracted dream demons. Even laughing too much was considered dangerous because it supposedly disrupted the humoral balance needed for restful sleep. These beliefs led to elaborate daily routines designed to prepare patients for healthy sleep hours before bedtime. Wealthy individuals might spend their entire afternoons engaged in prescribed activities designed to create optimal sleeping conditions. They would take specific types of baths, eat carefully planned meals, engage in approved forms of exercise, and avoid any activities that their physicians believed might interfere with rest. The medieval approach to sleep medicine also included extensive use of herbal remedies that ranged from genuinely helpful to actively dangerous. Medieval physicians had access to a wide variety of plants with real sedative properties, including valerian, chamomile, and lavender, which they often prescribed in effective doses. But they also used herbs that were toxic or hallucinogenic, believing that the altered states of consciousness produced by these plants were evidence of their healing power. Patients suffering from insomnia might be given doses of belladonna, hemlock, or mandrake, plants that could cause delirium, coma, or death. Medieval herbalists developed elaborate theories about which plants were most effective for different types of sleep problems. They believed that the shape, color, and growing conditions of medicinal plants determined their therapeutic properties through what they called the doctrine of signatures. Plants with heart-shaped leaves were thought to cure heart-related sleep problems. Flowers that bloomed at night were considered especially powerful for treating insomnia. Roots that resembled human figures were believed to have special power over dreams and nightmares. These beliefs led to the use of incredibly expensive and rare plants for sleep treatments. Medieval physicians would prescribe remedies that included ingredients imported from distant continents, gathered during specific moon phases, or blessed by particular saints. A single dose of some sleep medicines could cost more than a peasant family earned in a year. The preparation of medieval sleep medicines was also surrounded by elaborate rituals designed to enhance their effectiveness. Herbs had to be gathered at specific times, prepared using particular methods, and administered while reciting prescribed prayers or incantations. Some sleep medicines required months of preparation, with ingredients being processed through multiple stages of distillation, fermentation, and blessing. The final products were often more ritual objects than medical treatments, embodying medieval beliefs about the spiritual dimensions of health and healing. Medieval physicians also developed theories about the relationship between sleep and astrology that influenced their treatment approaches in profound ways. They believed that the positions of planets and stars affected both sleep quality and the effectiveness of sleep treatments, leading to incredibly complex scheduling systems for medical interventions. A patient's sleep treatment might be delayed for weeks until the planets were in the proper alignment for maximum effectiveness. Different phases of the moon were considered optimal for different types of sleep disorders. Even the time of day when medicines were administered was carefully calculated based on astrological considerations. These astrological approaches to sleep medicine created additional layers of expense and complexity that made effective treatment even more difficult to achieve. Patients would have to coordinate with astronomers, purchase specialized almanacs, and sometimes travel to specific locations where celestial conditions were considered most favorable for their particular sleep problems. The medieval integration of astrology in sleep medicine also meant that treatment failures were often attributed to improper timing rather than ineffective methods. If a patient didn't improve after expensive and elaborate treatments, physicians would blame unfavorable planetary influences rather than questioning their underlying theories about sleep and health. This astrological approach to sleep medicine persisted throughout the medieval period and influenced medical practice well into the Renaissance. The idea that celestial bodies affected human health wasn't just superstition. It was considered cutting-edge medical science that distinguished learned physicians from folk healers and traditional practitioners. Medieval sleep medicine also included elaborate surgical procedures designed to improve rest by physically altering the body's structure. Beyond trepanation for nightmares, medieval surgeons would perform operations to remove what they believed were physical blockages that prevented proper sleep. Patients suffering from snoring might have portions of their tongues or throats removed using crude surgical instruments and no anesthesia. Those with sleep-related breathing problems would undergo procedures to widen their nasal passages or remove tissue from their airways. These surgical interventions were incredibly dangerous and often fatal, but they were considered state-of-the-art medical treatment by the standards of the time. Medieval surgeons developed specialized instruments and techniques specifically for sleep-related operations, creating an entire surgical subspecialty devoted to rest-related disorders. The recovery from medieval sleep surgery was often worse than the original sleep problems. Patients would spend weeks or months healing from surgical wounds while trying to sleep in the same uncomfortable, unsanitary conditions that had contributed to their sleep problems in the first place. But perhaps the most bizarre aspect of medieval sleep medicine was how it combined all of these different approaches into comprehensive treatment programs that could last for years. A wealthy patient suffering from chronic insomnia might undergo bloodletting, purging, herbal treatments, environmental manipulation, surgical procedures, and astrological timing all simultaneously. These comprehensive programs created a medieval sleep medicine industry that employed thousands of physicians, surgeons, herbalists, astronomers, and support staff. Entire medical schools developed curricula specifically focused on sleep disorders, and some of the most famous medieval physicians built their reputations primarily on their supposed expertise in treating sleep problems. The irony is that most medieval sleep problems were probably caused by the same environmental and social conditions that made effective treatment impossible. The stress, discomfort, and danger of medieval life created sleep disorders that couldn't be cured by medical interventions, no matter how elaborate or expensive. Medieval physicians were trying to treat symptoms of a civilization-wide sleep crisis, using methods that often made the underlying problems worse. Their bloodletting weakened patients who were already malnourished. Their purging dehydrated people who were already struggling with poor health. Their surgical procedures created new sources of pain and infection in bodies that were already under enormous stress. But understanding medieval sleep medicine isn't just about cataloguing bizarre historical practices. It reveals important truths about how societies develop medical knowledge and how cultural beliefs influence approaches to health and healing. Medieval physicians were working with the best knowledge available to them, applying logical reasoning to observations about sleep and health that seemed accurate within their worldview. Their methods seem bizarre to us because we have different foundational assumptions about how the body works and what causes disease. The medieval approach to sleep medicine also demonstrates how economic and social factors influence medical practice in ways that can either help or harm patients. The elaborate and expensive treatments prescribed by medieval physicians served social and economic functions beyond their supposed medical benefits. Wealthy patients who could afford comprehensive sleep treatments gained social status from their ability to purchase cutting-edge medical care. Physicians who developed reputations for treating sleep disorders could charge enormous fees and gain influence within medieval society. These social and economic incentives encouraged the development of increasingly complex and expensive sleep treatments, even when simpler approaches might have been more effective. The medieval medical system rewarded innovation and elaboration rather than effectiveness, leading to treatments that were impressive but often harmful. Modern sleep medicine has inherited some of these same tendencies toward complexity and expense, though our underlying scientific understanding is much more accurate. Contemporary sleep specialists sometimes prescribe elaborate treatment programs that may be more about demonstrating expertise than addressing the root causes of sleep problems. Understanding medieval sleep medicine helps us recognize how cultural beliefs, economic incentives, and social expectations continue to influence medical practice today. It reminds us to question whether complex and expensive treatments are necessarily better than simpler approaches, and to consider how our own assumptions about health and healing might seem bizarre to future generations. The weird sleep medicine of medieval people wasn't just historical curiosity, it was a sincere attempt to address real human suffering using the best knowledge and methods available at the time. Their failures teach us as much about effective healing as their occasional successes, reminding us that medical progress requires not just new knowledge, but also the wisdom to abandon approaches that don't work, no matter how impressive or traditional they might seem. Perhaps most importantly, medieval sleep medicine demonstrates the fundamental human desire to find healing and rest, even under the most challenging circumstances. Medieval people were willing to endure painful and dangerous treatments because they understood something that modern, comfortable society sometimes forgets: that good sleep is essential for human flourishing, and that it's worth almost any sacrifice to achieve. Their bizarre treatments may not have worked, but their commitment to finding solutions to sleep problems reflects a deep understanding of how crucial rest is for physical health, mental well-being, and spiritual development. In their willingness to try anything that might help them sleep better, medieval people demonstrated a truth that remains relevant today: that the search for peaceful rest is one of the most fundamental human endeavors, driving innovation, creativity, and determination across all historical periods. The legacy of medieval sleep medicine continues to influence contemporary approaches to sleep disorders in subtle but important ways. Modern sleep clinics, with their elaborate testing equipment and comprehensive treatment programs, echo the medieval belief that sleep problems require complex, multifaceted solutions. Contemporary patients who undergo multiple sleep studies, try various medications, and invest in expensive sleep technologies are participating in a tradition that stretches back to medieval physicians who prescribed bloodletting, herbal potions, and environmental manipulations for the same underlying problems. The fundamental challenge remains the same across all historical periods. How do we help people find the rest they need to thrive? Medieval people approached this challenge with creativity, determination, and resourcefulness, even when their methods were misguided. Their example reminds us that the search for better sleep is a worthy endeavor that deserves our best efforts, informed by the best knowledge available, but always tempered by humility about how much we still don't understand about the mysterious process of human rest and recovery. The weird sleep habits of medieval people reveal a fundamental truth that we've lost in our modern world of memory foam mattresses and white noise machines. These weren't just primitive people making do with less. They were human beings who understood something profound about rest, community, and survival that our comfortable, isolated bedrooms have made us forget. Think about it. We spend thousands of dollars on the perfect mattress, invest in blackout curtains and temperature control systems, and still millions of us lie awake at 3 in the morning scrolling through our phones. Meanwhile, Medieval people who slept on straw, shared beds with strangers, and faced genuine life or death dangers every night, somehow managed to develop sleep patterns that modern science has proven might actually be more natural for human beings than our current approach. Their two-phase sleep cycle, their communal sleeping arrangements, their acceptance of discomfort and uncertainty. All of these weird habits served purposes that went far beyond just getting through the night. They created communities, strengthened relationships, and fostered resilience in ways that our individual sleep optimization completely misses. Medieval people understood that sleep wasn't just a biological necessity. It was a social activity, a spiritual practice, and a daily rehearsal for the ultimate challenges of life and death. Their bedrooms weren't just places to rest. They were theatres where the full drama of human existence played out night after night. Yes, their practices were often dangerous, uncomfortable, and based on beliefs that seem bizarre to us today. But their underlying insight remains profound. That good sleep isn't just about individual comfort, it's about feeling safe, connected, and part of something larger than yourself. Maybe we don't need to return to sleeping with livestock or sharing beds with strangers. But we might benefit from remembering that for most of human history, people found rest and recovery through community support, shared vulnerability, and acceptance of life's uncertainties rather than through perfect mattresses and complete control over our sleeping environment. The next time you find yourself lying awake at 2 a.m, instead of reaching for your phone or worrying about your sleep hygiene, you might whisper what medieval people knew by heart, that the darkness isn't empty time to be feared, but rich hours filled with possibilities for reflection, connection, and the kind of deep rest that comes not from perfect conditions, but from perfect acceptance of whatever the night might bring. Their weird sleep habits weren't just historical curiosities. They were sophisticated responses to fundamental human needs that still exist today. And in a world where loneliness, anxiety, and sleeplessness seem to grow more common every year, maybe it's time we stopped dismissing their wisdom as primitive and started recognizing it as profoundly, timelessly human. The medieval bedroom may have been cold, crowded, and dangerous, but it was also a place where people learned that true rest comes not from isolation and control, but from community, courage, and the deep peace that emerges when we stop fighting the darkness and learn finally to sleep.